Good evening. My name is Chase Robinson. I'm the interim president of the Graduate Center, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight's event, Crisis and Opportunity, the Future of Publishing. As many of you know, the Graduate Center is a graduate school of arts and sciences, a center for applied and theoretical research, and a platform for performance, conversation, and public debate. As a community of students and scholars committed to the idea that learning is a public good, we regularly offer public programs featuring eminent thinkers, cultural leaders, and distinguished artists addressing issues both pressing and perennial. To that end, we're delighted this year to present Cultural Capital, the Promise and Price of New York's Creative Economy, year-long institution-wide public programming that is exploring the city's creative and knowledge-based industries through an array of conversations, panel discussions, screenings, and performances. In particular, I'd like to call your attention to the final keynote program of the fall semester. On December 2nd, we'll host a conversation, What are the Economics of the Creative Economy? It'll feature Harvard economist Edward Glaser, former president of New York City's Economic Development Corporation, Seth Pinsky, NPR's Adam Davidson, and the Graduate Center's own geographer extraordinaire, David Harvey. Do mark your calendars. Now, our city's vitality has long been tied to the creative economy, from music to fashion to theater to arts institutions of all manner. Tonight we've convened a distinguished group to explore the current state and the near future of one of New York's signature creative industries, publishing. There is perhaps no creative industry that has been more buffeted by changes wrought by recent technological advance. Once feared to be on the brink of extinction, print media is currently being reinvented by industry leaders. Tonight's panel is uniquely equipped to discuss these changes. First, we're delighted to welcome Reagan Arthur. Ms. Arthur is a publisher of Little Brown. Before assuming her current role, she was editorial director of Reagan Arthur Books, an imprint of Little Brown. Ms. Arthur began her career at St. Martin's Press, and she's worked with Kate Atkinson, with Tony Early, Joshua Ferretz, Kathleen Kent, Joanna Scott, and many other distinguished writers. It's also our pleasure to welcome Jonathan Karp, president of Simon Schuster. Previously, Mr. Karp was editor-in-chief of Random House, where he began his career in 1989. Among the books he's acquired and edited are Seabiscuit by Laura Hillebrand, In One Person by John Irving, Thank You for Smoking by Christopher Buckley, and Franklin and Whiston by John Meacham. He's also overseen the publication of such bestsellers as Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson and Obama's Wars by Bob Woodward. We're also honored to welcome Molly Stern, Senior Vice President and Publisher of Crown Publishers, Broadway Books, and Hogarth. Ms. Stern oversees both hardcover and paperback trade fiction and nonfiction publishing programs. Since her start at Crown in 2010, Ms. Stern has acquired and developed books in narrative nonfiction areas such as biography, memoir, popular history, current events, and travel, and has worked to implement a new vision for Crown's fiction publishing program. Prior to joining Crown, Ms. Stern worked at Viking for 15 years, editing a range of critically acclaimed authors, including Geraldine Brooks, Garrison Keillor, and Sue Monk Kidd, amongst, again, many others. Finally, it's a pleasure to introduce Eric Simonoff as our moderator for tonight's event. Mr. Simonoff is a literary agent at William Morris Endeavor. He began his career in 1989 as an editorial assistant at W.W. Norton. In 1991, he moved to Janklow and Nesbitt Associates and became a director of the firm in 2007. 2 years later, he left for William Morris Endeavor, where his clients include Pulitzer Prize winners such as Edward P. Jones, Jhumpa Lahiri, Stacy Schiff, and many other critically and commercially acclaimed authors, from Jonathan Lethem to Bill O'Reilly. I'm also very pleased to say that Mr. Simonoff serves on the foundation board of the Graduate Center. Welcome, and off to you, Eric.
Thanks, Chase, and thank you all for coming. This is actually the third in a series of panels we've done on publishing. The first several years ago was about the future of the ebook. I think it was about 4 years ago, and so much has changed in those 4 years that that panel would now be worthy of a time capsule were you to look at it today. The second panel was a couple of years ago. It was on the future of the independent bookstore, which was very lively and a conversation about a sector of book selling which is incredibly important and of great interest not just to publishers but to readers everywhere. We determined it was not quite the endangered species that it seems to be. And tonight we're talking about not just the present and the future of publishing. We're going to go and flash back a little bit to talk about how much has changed in the 20 or so years that we've all been doing this. There is a very old publishing joke which may have already been used on this stage, which is that the first thing Gutenberg printed on his movable type press was the Bible. And the second thing was an article about the death of publishing. As long as we've been doing this, they've been telling us that publishing is dead or dying, and yet we keep publishing books and people keep reading books, which is what brings us to this evening. So all four of us started, if I'm not mistaken, as editorial assistants, fetching coffee, typing letters, reading manuscripts, rejecting manuscripts. I wanted to just get a little bit of a sense of the origin story and the trajectories of your careers for the audience. Do you want to go first, Reagan?
Sure. We three are all the 1989 club. You're a mere slip of a thing. You came a little later.
Yes, that's what I think.
Yeah, I moved here, and I grew up in Los Angeles, and I went to school out there, and I moved here in the fall of '89, and I answered an ad in the classified section. There actually was a way to get a job. I had no connections in publishing. There are publishing courses. I did not know about them or take one. But I was lucky enough to land at St. Martin's Press. I took a typing test. I still meet people in various related media. They're like, oh, I wanted to work in publishing, but I couldn't pass the test. You really had to do it on your little brown IBM Selectric. And then you typed a lot of memos. And anyway, and that was, so I worked for an editor who had his own imprint, Tom Dunn, and a very busy, active acquisitions process. And it was a great place to learn because you could, St. Martin's was very Catholic small c, and basically if you had a good idea, it didn't matter if you'd been there 5 minutes or 5 years, you could pursue it and buy it. So it was a great place to really learn from the ground up.
I too answered the classified ad in the New York Times. I too took the typing test. I had a typing business in college called Karp, the Macho Typist. I could type 100 words per minute. I got the job offer, and the most important thing you left out, though, about being assistant is taking dictation. I listened to the dictaphone tape of one of the great editors of our time, Kate Medina, and by actually typing her editorial memos, I really think I learned how to become an editor from doing that. And I stayed at Random House for 16 years through 4 publishers. I felt like J. Edgar Hoover, just watching the administrations come and go, and then I started an imprint at 12.
My story is slightly different simply because there is a slight generational blip.
Oh, don't rub it in.
No, I'm sorry. Only that I did know about the course, and I did go to a publishing course, and it actually gave me this panoramic view of the business that I think was enormously helpful at a very early stage of my career. It was a fantasy camp for publishing pretenders. It's now at the Columbia Publishing course, and the sort of incredible innovator and life force behind that course just passed away, but it was an extraordinary opportunity to learn about the business. All these publishing professionals came, sort of summer camp, and taught you all about the business. You invented a publishing house. I was teased mercilessly when I was chosen for publisher, and I showed up the next day in sweltering 90-degree Cambridge heat, because at the time it was at Radcliffe, wearing a blazer. was already wearing a suit to be the publisher. It was ridiculous. But from there, it was sort of 1994, and I think there was a sort of, but now I realize, of course, this constant anxiety about whether or not anyone can get a job in this business exists. But at the time, it really felt one of the more dire moments. But I was hired halfway through the course by an editor named Don Fair at Addison Wesley. They had a small trade imprint. They were a big education publisher, small trade imprint in New York, and it was a loft on Fifth Avenue, and I thought, this is surely this is publishing. And we had to fill out the contracts by hand, the editorial assistants. Email was new, but it was in the office. And just before he left to go to Viking, he did me the favor of introducing me to the publisher of Viking, who became my first real mentor, my first editorial mentor, Barbara Grossman. And I went there, and right after, I was there for almost a year and a half, went to Random House to work for Kate Medina, did take the dictation, wasn't for me, I must say. And I went right back to Penguin, where I then stayed and grew and was mentored by the now president of the company, Susan Kennedy, and for 15 years built a career there until I left to go be the publisher of Crown.
So interesting to note that really all four of us just kind of showed up, knocked on the door, and got these assistant positions, which were not glamorous, which were extremely low paying, and yet put us in proximity to authors and to the written world, which is what kept us engaged and brings us to the stage. Let me ask you how many applications you see for assistant positions currently. Are you flooded with them? Are there still eager young people getting off the bus from Indiana wanting to be editorial assistants?
Yeah. I'm looking for someone now, so I just.
You're looking for someone now?
So they really come in, and are you surprised? Do you think?
Well, I'm asking if you're surprised. It seems to me that there are so many portentous articles about the death of publishing and the demise of the brick and mortar bookstore and the disappearance of the physical book. Yeah. Are young people do they still arrive in New York City with the same glint in their eye?
I'm constantly amazed. And it's very renewing, their optimism and their singular desire to be part of this business is one of the great things about the work I do now, is an incredible group of committed young people, and they devote their lives to the work. It's amazing. And there's 10 people behind them.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
So something that I was thinking about recently was the fact that starting in the 90s with the movement toward the corporatization of publishing, you began seeing the editor as publisher fall away and the marketing expert as publisher, that is the job title publisher, become dominant. People who came up through sales and marketing the corporations felt more trust in them in terms of actually handling the business of publishing. So this is sort of a two-parter for anyone who wants to answer it. First, what is it that the publisher does as distinguished from the editor and the editor-in-chief? And secondly, do you read any significance in the fact that you all three came up through pure editorial and are now publishers?
I think I need to quibble with you.
Okay, quibble.
Because I don't really recall it being marketing driven. At least it wasn't at Random House. I mean, the publisher of Random House, three of the four were editors, and the fourth came from the production department, not the marketing department. So I don't think that was true where I was. And I do think that the difference probably in terms of the orientation that an editor might have versus a publisher. And I also think it's true that most of the really good editors do view themselves as the publishers of their books. But I do think that the editors really are thinking largely about what is between the pages of those hardcovers, or I guess those digits.
Digital files.
Those ones in those pixels. But I think the publisher's job is obviously to think more broadly about the conceptual appeal of the work and how to communicate it to the public, and then execute on a marketing plan.
I feel like the world has gotten a lot more complicated than it used to be, and then I would hate as an editor to have to be thinking like, what are the digital channels for this? And I welcome the marketing expertise and the expertise of every other department in the company to kind of help publish the books to the best of our collective abilities. So I do see that difference. I came up in, again at St. Martin's, which is a very particular kind of model, but you because there's so many books and so many editors really did have to kind of like do it on their own. There's a famous story of an editor who mailed out like 5,000 postcards to doctors' offices about a childbirth book that she was publishing, and it became a real sort of standard of the genre. But I mean, she just had to do that herself. Like, nobody was going to be, but that's an extreme example. And I think for us now, there are just so many ways to sell books, ways to publicize books. There's online marketing. You know, there's a lot of components that go into it, and an editor's very involved in that. But as you say, an editor's primary, I think, passion and skill is going to be in finding the books, editing them, and yes, helping being part of the process.
I was one of those editors who felt it was sort of my sacred duty to do everything I could beyond working with the author to perfect the book. I felt that it was it was incredibly important to be the sort of publishing wind behind its back. But I felt that as an editor, I was constraining. I didn't control budgets. I couldn't identify the opportunities as fully as I wanted to. And it felt to me that the only way to succeed as fully on behalf of the books that I loved was to be a publisher. And now I support editors and protect an editor's time and an editor's role, and I see that it's most important to protect their relationship and their time so they can develop these books the way they need to be developed. But I felt I couldn't do my job as well as I wanted to do it unless I could sort of expand my sphere of influence.
Let's get back a little bit to what you were talking about, Reagan, and the 5,000 postcards. So much of what you're tasked with doing is getting the word out. And for years, there were a handful of marketing tools that publishers used. One was print ads, obviously a major one, but newspapers have taken it on the chin, and print ads are not nearly as powerful, as significant as they used to be. Another was co-op advertising, which was convincing the brick and mortar chains to put stacks and stacks of your book in the front of the store and to buy into various promotional convincing programs. And one thing that we should explain is that when you walk into a Barnes & Noble and you see those tables at the front of the store, whether it's new nonfiction, new fiction, perfect book for Father's Day, all that real estate is essentially for sale. Barnes & Noble extracts money from the publishers to put those books there. And that's
Remember how the record industry, everyone was so scandalized when that came to light? It's like, the book industry's been doing that for a long time.
I know, but I think most consumers aren't aware of the fact that there is a commercial transaction that takes place between the bookseller and the publishers to put those books at the fronts of stores. But even that's diminishing because there's less foot traffic to brick and mortar stores, and the disappearance of Borders, the second major brick and mortar chain, has reduced the primacy of co-op advertising. So the question is, what replaces those tools? Those were at least two of the major tools at your disposal. What fills that vacuum?
I don't think you can underestimate voodoo.
Voodoo?
I think voodoo is, it's a useful strategy.
One obvious answer is the internet and social media. I mean, okay, so when I first got to Little Brown, we would have these weekly marketing meetings, and we'd talk about a given group of titles, and the publicist would say, you know, I've got her booked on this show, and going to these stores on tour, and feature here, and reviews confirmed here. And then the sole person in I don't even know if she had this title, but she was the online marketing person, and she would pass out a sheet, and she would say, well, the mommy bloggers love it, and we have this website, and blah, blah, blah. And basically, we just were like, we did not give her the time of day. The balance has completely shifted now. And the online marketing is a department of, 4 people or so, depending, and they have a huge range of contacts. There are lots of ways now to talk about books that have replaced the ways that disappeared, which is to say this is a country with one dedicated book review section now. I mean, that is a huge upheaval and loss that changes the way we talk about books, the way we hear about books, the way consumers and readers find out about them. How do you hear about them? And ads are not going to do it. I mean, publishers can't afford to advertise every single book in the New York Times. It just doesn't make sense. So social media is a great opportunity. It's a great new way for us to target audiences, to find readers, to talk about books. I mean, to me, it's a very exciting way, and it's a very new way, and it can seem very mom and pop and grassroots, but it's also, I think there's a ripple effect that can't be underestimated.
There is a word of mouth is now amplified exponentially. I think it is the most persuasive thing to me. I always feel if someone I respect and trust tells me they love a book, there's nothing more motivating than deciding to read it. But now that we can communicate in so many ways about why something's special to the people it matters to, it's actually it's opened up an entire new way of thinking about, or thinking a possibility for reaching readers.
Once upon a time, you could point to a couple of decisive breaks that a book got that made it big, and you could say, well, there was that great daily review in the Times, and then there was a great piece on All Things Considered, and that's when it really spiked. Do you think that's still the case, or do you think it's more this nebulous, people are tweeting about it, people
No,
are blogging?
I do still I mean, I don't mean to be so glib. I think that the social media is part of it, but I still think that it's reviews.
Old-fashioned media.
Yeah, I think that is the definite.
So still, old media is still what
Well,
can
I mean,
make
let me
a
give you an
big book.
example. Molly published a book called Gone Girl, and I bought that as a consumer because the reviewer in Entertainment Weekly was so over the top about it that, I mean, it was a reviewer who I'd read, who I respected, and it just, I knew that if he liked it that much, that it was a book I should read, and I couldn't stop once I started that book, and I think that obviously a couple million people had the same experience. So, you know, it does, I do think that, I think social media is definitely an important bit of amplification, but I still think that, you know, the endorsement of respected sources in the media is determinative in many, many instances.
I totally agree. I mean, I feel like that's the thing that makes, or sometimes sadly, tragically breaks a book is just, you know, the one killing, idiotic review. I'm still bitter. or the one really, like Kakutani about the goldfinch. Somebody said,
Stephen King about the goldfinch.
Yeah.
I mean, when Stephen King says this is the kind of book that comes along once every decade, you know, how can you not? I bought the book on Amazon. I didn't even want to bother you.
There is a layering effect. I mean, by the time that review for Gone Girl ran in Entertainment Weekly, I think we'd pre-sold, you know, 20,000 copies. I mean, it was the review that sold you, but there were a series of events that it was as if we were all in a big echo chamber by the time that review ran, and that's one of the extraordinary effects, I think, not just of social media, but about the way media is constantly reflecting itself in a way that's very powerful and I think very new.
Well, let's go back to Gone Girl for a second. I was going to bring it up anyway as a case study. So, is it Gillian or Gillian?
Gillian.
Gillian Flynn. So Gillian Flynn, this is not her first book, not her second book, but her third book.
The magic third book. The second book is very difficult. I think we've all, sorry to interrupt you, but I have this whole theory about the second book, which there's nothing more dangerous for a successful writer than to write a second novel. And there's no more...
Usually you have to write that before you write the third book.
Well, if you could figure out how to jump from the first to the third, I suggest you do it. Unfortunately, it's not the way it works. There is nothing more powerful, I think, than establishing yourself in a reasonable way with two good books. There is no more bigger opportunity than that third book, in my opinion. The danger, I don't know if you can speak to this, the danger of the second book is something you have to like gird yourself and get through after a first successful book. Does anybody know who wrote Autograph Man?
Sadie Smith.
Sadie Smith.
Okay. But you really know that she wrote,
example.
you know that she wrote White Teeth. And it was, Autograph Man was her second novel. It was her least successful book. I think she's the first to say she wishes she hadn't written it. But she went on, that third novel was on beauty and reestablished her reputation as one of the preeminent novelists of our time. And I think, sort of lost the thread here, but I think Gillian Flynn was poised. If she took her game, she wrote something exquisitely complicated and good, brought all of her powers to bear, and I think that she really cut her teeth in those first two books, and when you read it, you knew it. You knew it.
Well, that's to me the interesting part of this whole story, because they knew it. And I think if I were one of you out there in the audience, I would be wondering, well, how can any publisher really know when they have something that's going to sell 1 million, 2 million, 3 million copies?
I didn't know that. I was hoping we'd
You
sell
knew you
200,000 copies.
But you knew, okay, but even to assume that you could sell 200,000 copies, there was something about that book, and I think that all of us who read it, it had a life force about it. It had a particular kind of intelligence and exuberance, and it had a life force that just was better than any other thriller published in a long time.
I read it and thought it was a commercial masterpiece.
I thought it was like as good as Presumed Innocent. I mean, it gave me that same feeling.
But it makes me think also of the first Elizabeth Kostova novel. That had an inevitability to it that felt very fresh.
This is one of Reagan's books called The Historian, which was a first novel
It debuted at #1 in the New York Times
only
bestseller.
time.
And debuted at number
You're
one.
like my publicist.
So actually, let's put a pin in Gone Girl and flash back to the historian. So here's a big, fat, 700-page first novel about historical vampires, sort of, right? Is that accurate?
About Dracula himself.
Yeah, about Dracula himself. No one in the world's ever heard of Elizabeth Kostova because it's a first novel, and yet the book debuted at #1 in the New York Times bestseller
At a
list.
time when there were pre-orders even possible? Like, what happened?
Well, yeah, you guys have to plug your ears and you tell us the secret of how you did that.
That was, well, it's interesting because we paid a lot of money for that, and it was much written about, much like a deal a couple weeks ago that I'm sure we were all in on, a first novel that sold to Knopf for a lot of money. And it's always like, it makes you nervous on everybody's behalf because you don't want the discussion eventually to be about the money. You know, it just does the author no favors, and people sort of look at it more critically than it deserves. But anyway, so there was just, the best thing you can do before a book is published is get as many people reading it. And, you know, that's what you guys did with Gone Girl. I mean, like, there were galleys and people were talking about it, and I was hearing about it so far in advance of it existing. And so that's what we tried to do with the historian on a very accelerated schedule. I remember we did a pillow drop at the Librarians Convention, and we had excerpts printed with the cover, and we gave them to all the librarians in their rooms when they arrived, and they loved what they read. And it's a book about books, and so that's always, you know, that was a good target audience for us to go to. And so you just have, and then there were other things. We did a pre-sale tour where she went out, and this is not, they don't have to cover their ears for this. Everybody does this, you know, to meet booksellers and media people, and she's lovely, and everybody loved her, and so there was a wave of goodwill. And also there was a pretty short time between when we bought it and when we published it. We really tried to accelerate.
So first, the editor has to love it. The publisher has to love it. Everybody within the publishing company has to love it spontaneously.
It's very hard. I mean, these guys are more powerful than I am, but I find that although I went to a company where we had to really rethink what we published and how we published. It was an enormous challenge and an enormous opportunity, but it took a very long time in an august company like Random House to establish your credibility. You know, I'm with, you know, two of the best publishing divisions in the world, and then I'm Crown, right, who has only published a certain kind of book for a long time. And it was very hard to get people to believe me. They loved Gillian Flynn. They had been publishing her. There had been 2 books that there was a cult, credible cult who loved her. But to get everybody behind me for Gone Girl was, I can't tell you, it feels silly now, but at the time they wanted to talk about this. They wanted to say, no, what we're talking about now, the book we're going to talk about now is Gone Girl. And they're like, oh my God, have we talked? And you just never stop. You just never stop. I could have been wrong. I'm wrong every day, but that was one you had to keep hammering it. That's part of the reason I'm proud of it, is just because people felt they got it. They knew. But we did everything we could think of and more to support that book, because none of it for my company was inevitable.
And when did you know it was really working?
I mean, I think by the time it went on sale, I remember standing on the corner in Brooklyn yelling at the inventory guy because like they couldn't get the books out fast enough, and we'd pre-sold 42,000 copies before the book went on sale, and the Janet Maslin review had run. What we didn't see was the long tail. We didn't see that it was going to become a sort of touchstone book. It just then it has nothing to do with you after that.
Well, I was going to ask about that. So how does that happen? Usually the trajectory for big commercial fiction is it comes on the list very high. The next week, 5 more books come onto the list and push it a little bit farther down. And then the next week, 5 more books come on the list and push it farther down.
Let's get 3 weeks on the list.
Right.
You know?
So getting 3 weeks on the list
They
is
never saw
actually
#1 coming.
a pretty typical run for a very successful commercial novel. And then it gets pushed off the list because things keep cycling through. How do you become the book that is still on the list 72 weeks later? How many weeks has it been on the list?
I mean, you've all had successes like this. If I could put that in a bottle, I would. There is, and I have been asked sundry settings, how, why. I could say 7 different initiatives that I think were impactful, but I think I could never replicate it. It's
word of mouth. I mean, it's that book that just becomes the one you have to read because everybody, you're like, I don't know what the number is. Maybe if the 4th person tells you, like, same with Seabiscuit.
How many people have read Gone Girl? Raise your hand if you've read it. Okay, I suspect a lot of you will probably now be going home and reading that. But you know, the thing is, you know, we talk about it as if it's some big secret, and it was a really great read. It was a portrait of a marriage from a perspective you've never quite seen it. It was a book you just had to tell people about. And I mean, the real question is not why did Gone Girl succeed the way it did. I mean, to me, the real question is why there are so few books like Gone Girl, or like The Historian, or like Seabiscuit. One of my former colleagues, Dan Menaker, he said that, he was the editor-in-chief of Random House, and at the time he said, well, how many books do you think that we're publishing this year that are actually going to still, be read, 10, 20, 30 years from now? And he said, you probably count it on one hand.
But that's okay.
It's okay, but it's amazing. I mean, you wonder, well, if we each publish hundreds of books a year, or 100 books a year, why is it that more of them don't rise to that level?
In my list, I think very carefully, I think we all do, about what we're buying. And for me, every book has its place. There's a reason this editor has to buy this book, because eventually they're going to buy this history, because someday they're going to buy Stacey Schiff. Right? There's always there's a logic, an internal logic to the choices you make, and it's not always a question of lasting value. You can be wrong a lot, books fail mostly, but I think what I try very hard to justify its existence, and there are myriad reasons for its place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I have to assume that all three of you have acquired and published books that you believed were absolutely extraordinary, that vanished utterly without a trace.
Most of them.
No?
Yeah.
I think that there haven't been that many that vanished without a trace. I mean, I
Or
think
underperformed. Surprised you by underperforming.
Oh, well, yeah, well, you're going to, no, I mean, I think that the average, I think that the industry average is something like probably, at best, 25% of the books carry the other 75%. So the 75% are falling short of where the acquiring editor thought they would be, just on a financial baseline. So that's always been the case, but that's probably the case in almost every cultural industry. I think that's probably true for the music industry, the movie industry too. I mean, the hits pay for the flops. It still though does amaze me. I mean, you're right, Molly. I mean, a lot of the books are acquired for multitudinous reasons. And I guess there aren't that many authors who are writing in a major key on big themes that everybody relates to.
And they come around, I think those books come around once between every 5 and 10 years. We just were all bidding on one of them, a book called City on Fire. That was so ambitious, so audacious, so accessible, so rich, so populated with such extraordinary characters that you just thought, this is why we do this. But this is not our bread and butter. This is not what our business is solely made of. It can't be.
So there's an expectation with the first novel like City on Fire. First novel, City on Fire, submitted to all the major houses, provoked a storm of enthusiasm among publishers and a crazy auction, and it went for a reported more than $2 million advance.
You say crazy because you weren't the agent.
That's right. It wouldn't be crazy if I were the agent and you paid that much money, but it was not me. So we can talk about a little bit about this. There's no track record. That is, there's no first book or second book. You can't point to how many copies were sold at Barnes & Noble. You can't point to how many copies were sold at Amazon. So it's a completely liberating experience for the publisher to bid on a first novel for that reason and project all your hopes, dreams, and fantasies on the way that it might actually turn out. Does that book have to be Gone Girl to make sense at that level?
No.
So what has to happen?
That was a very different book from Gone Girl.
Right.
He just means, you mean from a success point of view?
From a success point of view.
No, I mean, I think it has to sell 600,000 copies, but maybe less. I mean, it depends on how your P&L looks, but no, it does not have to be Gone Girl. Gone Girl's The Help. You know, it's a whole other thing.
You can't possibly go into whoever you have to ask for that money and put Gone Girl numbers in there. You'll be laughed out of.
You can talk about Gone Girl sort of qualitatively. It has this quality of Gone Girl. We all do this when Eric Simonoff sends us a novel. We'll say, you know, he represents Jhumpa Lahiri, and this has this sort of quality, the skills, the idea of the outsider, whatever, assimilation, whatever her themes are. But to go in and say, I'm comping this to Gone Girl from a sales perspective is madness.
It's just useless. And I've also we just had our sales meeting last week for the new list, and we're running through with the editors, and someone said, I'm going to say it's like Gone Girl, but about X, and I was like, please don't.
Right.
You know, and the way it's been invoked so many times now, and I just feel like it's not a useful benchmark for sales reps to use anymore, because I'm sure
You can
every
feel how things
bookseller's
start to
hearing
sort of
it too.
eat themselves. You guys published Maria Semple's book, Where'd You Go, Bernadette? And every sort of mildly charming, high-end, wittily written special book for women, I feel I'm always invoking Where'd You Go, Bernadette?
Can I just say that's my favorite story to use as the other second novel story, which is Maria Semple is a delightful novelist, and my colleague Judy Klain bought her first novel called This One Is Mine. It sold about 7 copies, and nothing happened. Maria actually made, if you go online, you can find this really funny video she made getting ready for Where'd You Go, Bernadette, where she goes around, she lives in Seattle, so she goes to Elliott Bay, and she talks to, for some reason, Tom Skerritt, the actor, I mean, she must know him. Anyway, she has all these people, and she goes and she interviews them. Like, she goes into Elliott Bay, and she says, so I'm publishing a novel, it's epistolary, and they never say it. And I had a first novel, it's called This One Is Mine. He looks it up. We sold 1 copy. You know, it's like all the things that face a second novelist after the first novel really just didn't work, which happens more often than not.
It seems to be that book really built, though.
It had this total word. It had, again, the word of mouth. It was fresh. It was original, and
But it didn't feel out of the gate the way Gone Girl was. It was preordained by the time it went on sale.
Partly because we had to overcome that,
Yeah.
because the orders were based on the track, and so we did get a lot more out than we had sold of This One Is Mine, which is already a huge accomplishment.
Right.
But then to build on that. But I like that story because we bought that after This One Is Mine. We knew what we had sold and that it was going to be hard, but there was such love already for the novel and for what we could do with it. And there was a real, you're facing skeptical people in-house, just like you were, and you have to just like barrel through and say this is going to do it. But it was a slower build because of that second novel-itis.
So when did you know that Where Did You Go, Bernadette was working?
Well, let's see, around this time last year when Michael Peach, my predecessor, had this job, as I understand it, he spent most of his Christmas vacation on the phone with Amazon and our printers because there was a printer's error. And it was like there had been some massively great review that sparked a lot of Amazon orders. But Amazon, if there's any kind of customer complaint, will pull the buy button, and that's what happened.
Oh,
no.
Yeah, that's very frustrating.
They pull the buy button. I mean, you go to Amazon, you look up Where'd You Go, Bernadette, and there's no button to press.
You can buy the Kindle edition. Anyway, but it was like the demand was, so that was
But it was just Christmas time, and no one buys around then anyway.
but it was around this time last year. Yeah, but I don't remember the exact, because I was sort of on the sidelines then, and I wasn't monitoring as closely as I would have been.
Well, you're making my job very easy. So there's no buy button for the physical edition, but there's a buy button for the Kindle edition in that case. So you're technically never really out of stock. What was the ratio of hardcovers to ebooks, if you remember, for that book? And what's the ratio now of the paperback to the ebook?
Well, it's an interesting, I'd be so curious to hear what you guys think, because my feeling on that is hardcover, ebook, paperback, we can't figure it out. There's no law, and I think, you definitely sell more ebooks for fiction than nonfiction is a safe enough thing to say.
Yeah.
But for example, last year I had 2 first novels that I published, around the same time of year, same sort of critical reception, same sales, very strong in hardcover, same ebook sales. It was like 1-to-1, hard and ebook. And then a year later, the paperbacks came out. One of them just like it's in its 13th printing, 9 months along. The other one sort of just and didn't catch hold in the same way. So what's the difference? I can't say we changed the cover on that one. Maybe that's it. I don't. But there's no science to it. It's just something. So the fear is that the ebook is going to eat at the paperback sale because that's the audience.
And it is. I think it really is.
Well, this is the big question that's been asked since ebooks really began exploding. Are they additive? That is, do you ultimately sell more copies in the aggregate than you would have otherwise, or are they cannibalistic? And if they're cannibalistic, what are you not selling instead of selling ebooks? And you think it's paperbacks?
I think paperbacks are truly challenged. It's a very interesting moment for paperbacks. Paperbacks, for a long time, have been very much about new channels of distribution and price point, right? Hardcovers don't go into every retail environment, but paperbacks can go into many more. There used to be the great mass market paperback, the racks at the supermarkets. Those exist to some degree, but mostly it's gone. It was one of the great innovations of the business was the mass market paperback. That's really gone. That's really been replaced by the ebook, I think. The sort of voracious reader reading the very inexpensive genre book is reading it in e. And now we have these, and we spend a great deal of time and effort on how they look and how these physical objects that are now paperbacks, what they are saying to the consumer. And you can feel, as channels of distribution sort of shut down, there are fewer ways, I think, to reignite conversation about a book that's already gone into the marketplace in its first format. And which is to say the hardcover edition is the moment, is the freshest moment for a book, right? It's the original moment. What happens in financial accounting terms in publishing houses, the 13th month of a book's life is its backlist life. That's when you start thinking about it as backlist dollars. I think we have to stop thinking about it as a format, as a price point, but as we have to think about it, how do we talk about this book now that it's not fresh but still relevant? It's the 13th month and then the rest of its life. And that is a question we could say the second bite at the apple with the price point and the paperback. If that disappears, it doesn't mean the content doesn't matter or isn't relevant or there aren't readers for it and people willing to buy it. It's just they may not buy it in a physical format, and that's harder because it's not new anymore. Does that make sense? So I'm trying to retrain myself to think about books as a sort of constant rather than like a changing format, which is how we're trained. That'll be for the paperback, that'll be for the ebook, that'll be, this is the first moment, the hardcover's the first moment. That just isn't true anymore. That's all, talk about voodoo. It's one book with many moments. And how should that change your thinking about publishing?
Well, ours is a very hidebound industry, and for the longest time, a hardcover would come out, and then 12 months later, a paperback would come out. Those windows are now narrowing.
Yeah.
Do you think it's approaching?
Or in the case of our book, Gone Girl.
Or in the case of
Now,
Gone
all of
Girl,
ours,
it's still in hardcover.
Why
That
would
is,
you?
why would you
would
ever
you
print a paperback and make less money per copy than you would on hardcover?
It's amazing how much analysis we have done about at what moment do you start, does the shift really matter where you're really blowing out a paperback in the hardcover price point? It's much more profitable to be in paperback. It's amazing how many spreadsheets I've looked at. Like, what's the moment? What's the moment? When should we flip the switch? It's very hard to divine, and there aren't that many models for it.
Let's flash back and talk about mass market paperbacks for a second. So you call mass market paperbacks one of the great innovations of publishing. And mass market paperbacks are the little, how would you describe them? Small trim size in racks and 7-Elevens and supermarkets.
Cheap
and that kind of
paper, they were meant to be disposable almost.
So yeah, essentially disposable. Smaller, lower price point than trade paperbacks. And they were hugely dominant, 60s, 70s, 80s, especially for commercial fiction and even for some commercial nonfiction. And significantly, they were used as a farm team for commercial fiction writers. So you'd write your first thriller, and it would be published by a mass market house, and they'd get tons of copies out and get maybe 50% of those back, but you'd sell a bunch, and then you'd do your second one, and then when you built up a critical mass of readers in that format, in the mass market format, maybe you'd then be brought on as a hardcover author, and that's how a lot of
Lee
thriller
Child
writers.
is probably the most recent example of that. His
Lee
first
Child,
book was
you're
a
saying.
paperback.
Do you think that can still happen?
Well, this is my question. Hey, you anticipated my question?
Sorry.
Could this, that's okay. Could this still happen?
Get in trouble with the moderator.
And because there's been a collapse in the mass market distribution channels.
It's happening, but it's ebooks now, in theory. It's 50
that's-
Shades of Grey that was, or
Right.
maybe I'm told it was not actually a digital book before it became.
Well, the genius of 50 Shades of Grey was they put it in print, right? That was the genius. They saw an ebook being sold. It wasn't really in print. The things that publishers can still do really powerfully are distribute physical books. So they bought the physical rights to the book and the ebook for a lot of money at the time. But once that book went into physical distribution, it was the non-chronic readers buying it, which is to say, the readers reading that kind of thing voraciously are now on e. It was the people who hadn't gone into a bookstore in 9 years that went into a store and said, I don't have an e-reader, I'm not a reader, but I want to read 50 Shades of Grey. That was it. It was a physical play.
I won't ask how many people have read 50 Shades of Grey. However, I will ask for a show of hands of people who would recognize the cover or who can describe the cover. Does everyone know what the cover of 50 Shades of Grey looks like? So it's absolutely iconic. Very simple, very direct, but it leads to this question, what is the purpose of a cover today in the publishing world? That is, it used to be that the cover was absolutely paramount because it wrapped the hardcover, and it was a question of display. You'd walk into a bookstore and you would judge a book literally by its cover. Now, if you're online, the cover is this big. It's a tiny little image that most of the detail of which is lost. So has your thinking about jacketing, covers, design changed with the advent of the ebook?
Well, I think we definitely think about how the covers will look online. We think about that a lot, and red against a black background, for example, doesn't work so well. But in a way, it's been liberating, because it used to be that you really did have to, sometimes you had to make commercial compromises in the way the covers looked, because the booksellers were a brake on anything that was a little bit too arty. So now, because now we can make the covers, at least I feel liberated. I feel like I can go with the most beautiful, adventurous cover I want. And it doesn't matter as much, because clearly the books are not selling solely off of the covers.
It's funny, I think it's so interesting. I think that's a totally valid perspective. I think it's more important than ever. I think that people have more opportunities than ever to see visuals outside of the bookstore. That one of the great gifts I can give a book is a sort of sense of visual understanding that speaks to the audience I think wants it. And I think at a certain point, I don't know, maybe my husband was telling me this, like the world is going to be full of LED screens, and we are just going to be bombarded with visuals, and they have to be compelling in order to capture your attention. And I think it's one of the most powerful drivers, this ineffable, and my team at Crown knows, I mean, it's like my obsession. I spend so much time thinking about it and working on it, because I have this sort of ineffable feeling, this sort of inchoate feeling that it matters more than ever.
You agree?
Yeah. No, I love it. But we definitely, sometimes we'll actually, I just had to do this, change an existing cover for the thumbnail, the Amazon image of it, because we realized we'd printed it. Looks great in real life. And then we looked at it on Amazon. So you can but the great thing is you can do that quickly. You can just go in there and make the necessary adjustments. But I do think sometimes that's the only way that someone's going to see your book is that cover. So it's definitely, and it's a really fun part of the job too.
It is the fun part, that's true.
So in the course of our 10 years in publishing, we've seen the rise of the Barnes & Noble Superstore. The Barnes & Noble Superstore was the huge controversy of the 90s, where they would move in a neighborhood where there was an existing independent bookstore, open a giant superstore, give massive discount to customers, offer them coffee, and drive the competition out of business. Now they're experiencing a much more challenging retail climate than ever before. They're closing stores across the country. Their only major brick and mortar chain competitor, Borders, vanished a couple of years ago. And Barnes & Noble has taken to, in some sense, referring to their stores as showrooms. Their worry, their anxiety is that people go to a Barnes & Noble, browse those tables, see your jackets, leaf through the book, and then sometimes even while standing in the store, order from Amazon. Do you think that's in fact what consumers are in some case actually doing?
It makes sense. It's enormously convenient not to have to carry a book around, especially if you're reading all the time, which book lovers do. It is a great conundrum, because I think it will be terrible if Barnes & Noble can't survive. It will be very bad for us.
Well, the buzzword that we're all talking about lately these days is discoverability. How do people discover books? And certainly one of the most significant ways people have traditionally discovered books is at bookstores. So let's talk for a minute about the possibility of a world without a major brick and mortar chain. How do people discover books? You can't?
Can't do it.
I mean, it would be devastating for the business. But I will say it's not just the chains. The independent booksellers, Amy Einhorn, who's a friend of ours, published The Help, and she's told me that it was the independents who really made The Help, who were the first sort of line of, I don't want to say offense. Anyway, they were the ones, there were independent booksellers who got it and talked about it and sort of talked it up, and then the chains kind of caught up, is my understanding. And so places where there's still that personal connection to a book, that personal response, the human connection where you talk about it with your customers that happens on a wide, national scale, book store to store, is really powerful and can make a difference for a lot of books. So I think that the thing about Barnes & Noble is you don't hear about that happening on a personal, you hear about what they do, they get behind a book. They have the Discover program for first or second novels. They have their Barnes & Noble, what do they call it, selects or
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Recommends.
recommends, which, I had a book in there, they order a ton of copies, they give it a ton of promotion, they really do get behind it. And so they're very valuable. It's just very,
Well, I was just going to say the weird and valuable thing about the chain is that you go in there maybe expecting to buy one book, but you often leave with 3. That, for the industry,
And a toy.
is the real, and a toy, and a game, apples to apples, maybe. And that is, I think, actually the real challenge. When Borders went away, they saw the independents immediately began to thrive. But that still, there was a sort of like 30% that couldn't be replaced, that impulse purchase, it just wasn't replaced. And that's a significant loss for us industry-wide. That's a loss of discovery, right? The impulse buy for the book you didn't know you wanted, you're just gonna try. When those chain stores go away, I think impulse buying goes away.
And that doesn't, sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, first of all, Barnes & Noble, if you take, they are still profitable if you take out their Nook business. So if you just looked at their retail returns, they're making plenty of money. So I'm not so sure that we need to assume they're going to go out of business. I realize that it could happen, but I don't think you need to assume that. The second thing I wanted to say was that I think that the independent booksellers they're doing fine. I think they've actually picked up a little bit of share. I don't know. I don't think it's. I'd be curious to ask the audience. Would you please just raise your hand if you've stopped buying physical books?
not many.
Okay, now raise your hand if you intend to keep buying physical books. You see, so this is why I think that I mean, I'm not. For those of you who didn't turn around, most people raised their hands, and no matter who I talk to, whenever I do ask that question, I was just at a graduate seminar where there were 25 really smart 20-somethings, and they all said that they intended to keep buying printed books, to some degree.
The question is where? So
Yeah.
how many of the people who buy physical books buy them from Amazon?
Primarily from Amazon.
Um,
And how many buy primarily from their local independent?
And what about Barnes & Noble? Raise your hand if you're... Here's the thing, I want to share an experience that I had as a consumer because I'm still kind of struggling with this. So, and this may sound really obvious, but I went to Barnes & Noble and there was a biography I wanted to buy that was $40. And they were not discounting it at all. And I had my Barnes & Noble card, so I could have maybe saved $4, but with the tax, it would have still been probably in the high 30s. I went to Amazon and I could get it for $22. So it was like an $18 price difference. And I don't mean to sound like a total tightwad, but $18 is a lot of money. And I couldn't rationalize spending that money at Barnes & Noble. And I'm just wondering, well, if I'm having that experience, I can't, why would anybody buy a $40 biography at Barnes & Noble? And I apologize to those of you who work for Barnes & Noble if you're here,
I have my husband so trained, like, we do not buy books from Amazon. I love Amazon as a client, and I mean, we have a wonderful independent bookstore in the town where I live, and that's where we buy our books. So we were going back to LA for Christmas a couple years ago, and I really wanted that Doonesbury 100-year, massive thing. So he dutifully ordered it at our independent bookseller, stuffed it in our suitcase, took it with us to California where I unwrapped it and then brought it back. And also we got no discount on it. So I was like, oh, this is like a very expensive, heavy mistake. So yeah, the Amazon has price advantages.
I think pricing is also, along with the retail challenges, pricing is one of the big conundrums of our business. The business is a fantasy of pricing inflation, and our entire business is built on it. And I don't know how long we can resist the pressure from retailers to give their customers the best deal and the cheapest books. And at Random House, there's a ton of resources going into analyzing price and at what moment a book is bought simply because it's $2.99 rather than for its content. I mean, there's a ton of thinking going to where is the moment if we sell a book at this price, when does it really become unprofitable? Where do we start to lose market share and a sense that our business model makes any sense? I think it's actually, I feel I sound so doomsday-ish, and I wish I were, I'm fighting the good fight, but I think price is is a huge problem.
Do you mean for physical books as well, or only for ebooks?
For physical books too, I think if they have to maintain their high price point in order for us to sort of make sense of how we do our business, I think the business is imperiled.
Well, here's a question for
Yeah,
the
I just
audience.
think Barnes and Noble should discount more. But
Right. Maybe it's that
One
simple.
simple solution.
sorry.
No, another question for the audience. So how many people buy some of their books to read digitally on a device and some of their books to read physically? So a mix. So this is an interesting,
Yeah, I'm curious to know how many people think they should be bundled. Would you buy an ebook and a physical book?
if you could buy a hardcover, or you could buy a hardcover and for an extra premium get a hardcover and the ability to read it on your device.
Doesn't that seem like the best of
Is
both
that
worlds?
appealing to anybody?
I feel like this is really valuable market research.
I know, it
Yes.
sounds like it. Thank you.
Thank you all for participating in our market survey.
They didn't have to pay for this.
That's true. That's right. So let's talk about bundling. So I am reading The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. I'm almost finished. It is phenomenal. It's big and fat. It's 760 pages long. I was given a copy. Thank you very much, Reagan. And I bought a copy on the Nook because it's too heavy to carry in the subway every day. So it's a bit inconvenient because when I'm at home, I read the physical version.
But you're glad you have the physical version, right?
It's a beautiful book. Yeah, it's a beautiful book, and I prefer to read books physically still. And yet it's very convenient reading on the iPhone or the iPad or the Nook itself. Do you think about bundling? Do you think about offering two for the price of one, the physical and the ebook edition?
People above my pay grade are thinking very hard about this. I think I would like logic to prevail sometimes. Like, here's how consumers think. I think Amazon, one of the particular genius of that retailer is all they really think about and care about is their customer. What does their customer want? That is not my preoccupation at all. My preoccupation is how good is this book and how can I get people to care about and read it, right? That's all I care about. I do think, though, if there was attention paid to how do you guys really want to experience this and us not losing our shirts, that would be great. But it's an expensive, weird business, and I think our model has to be complex.
Yeah, I think it'll happen.
The resistance early on was that it would in some way devalue in the minds of customers what an ebook was worth. That's what most of the CEOs I spoke to said initially. That is, if you say the hardcover is $28, but for $31 you'll get the hardbook and the ebook, the hardcover and the ebook, then the consumer says, oh, the ebook's worth $3 in that case. That was 4 years ago the rationale that publishers used for not doing it, but that seems to have faded away. Consumers have been trained they do have to pay for digital content in books. You think this is inevitable ultimately?
I don't know. I mean, I guess you're smarter than I am. So
Well, no,
you
I
say
don't
so.
know.
No, I remember talking some years ago about when ebooks were just starting to bubble up, and I said, why don't we just do what movies do? You know, you can only see it in the theater for a certain amount of time, and then you know that the DVD is coming. You can choose to see it now, or you can wait. And I thought that was. It wasn't my idea or anything, but it just seemed like the best model. And he was like, the customers will revolt. And he was absolutely right. That would just not, you're punishing a whole segment of your audience for the way they want to read your book. But what drove me nuts and what seems to have diminished is the perception that because I can push a button and it arrives on my device, I shouldn't have to pay more than 99 cents, which was, I think, a big sort of genius marketing campaign of Amazon to sort of establish that as the price of an ebook, which doesn't take into account the fact that somebody wrote it, somebody edited it, somebody produced it. There is a production cost of a digital ebook, of an ebook. So that was, I think, a big sort of psychological campaign that we had to wage to convince people that there's a value, you know. And then it's interesting when ebooks get discounted, you know, then we have a lot of discussion like, well, if you have a one-day sale, as often happens, $1.99, $2.99, does that further send the message that that's what a book is worth? And I feel no. I mean, if I get a really great pair of shoes on sale for $20, I think I got a great deal. I don't expect for the rest of my shopping experience to find that same price on every pair of shoes I buy. So, but it's a weird thing because, yeah, it's like it's not an object. It's just something you're looking at.
And are you all playing with price promotions in the ebook space? That is, for a 24-hour period, this title is 99 cents, but afterwards it goes back up to $6.99?
Yeah, I have to say, we had an extraordinary experience with one of these price promotions recently. There was a memoir that we published called Brain on Fire. And it received national attention, it received good reviews, it was a bestseller for 1 week, and was selling well. After the book had been out for a few months, it was in one of those $2.99 promotions, I think, and it rocketed to the top of the bestseller list. And we've now sold over 100,000 copies of the trade paperback edition, and it's showing no signs of slowing down.
The physical trade.
The physical trade paperback edition.
And you think that's wedded somehow to this pricing
I
promotion?
really do. I think that the price promotion got the book out to a large number of people. I think more than like 15 or 20,000 people who bought it in ebook, and they talked about it. And the word of mouth was galvanizing, and as a result, Brain on Fire has been on the trade paperback bestseller list for, I think, about 10 weeks now, and it's showing no signs of declining.
And the ebook price went back to its ordinary level?
I really think the ebook helped. I think that.
But it's regular price?
Oh yeah. No, that was just a 1 week promotion.
Right.
Wow.
Or maybe actually it might have been 2 weeks, but it was really helpful.
So if you're right, Barnes & Noble will not disappear, and the brick and mortar bookstore will prevail. And if you're right, physical hardcovers and paperbacks will continue to exist. People seem to buy a blend, in some cases physical editions, in some cases ebook editions. So let's talk about those differentials. Gone Girl, we'll talk about again. How many ebooks do you sell for every hardcover that you sell, if you can say?
2 ebooks for every hardcover.
So 2 ebooks
And
for
right
every
from the
hardcover that you sell. Doris Kearns Goodwin, hardcover versus e.
We're selling a lot more hardcovers.
Right, a lot more. Say
I would say
3
3 to
hardcovers
1.
for every one.
Yeah.
Right? So a complete inversion of Gone Girl in a certain sense. Why?
Well, there is some conventional wisdom right now that people seem to want to read nonfiction in a way that isn't maximized by the ebook. They don't necessarily read it immersively from beginning to end. So they might read different parts of the book. That may be one cognitive explanation for why nonfiction isn't as widely read on ebooks. It may simply be that the demographic that's buying nonfiction prefers to have it in
Especially
a printed
history, I
form.
think.
I mean, I have to say, the Doris Kearns Goodwin book it's a beautiful book.
It is.
And I would want to keep, and she's kind of an institution. New York Magazine called her America's historian-in-chief. We're using that in our ad. So it may be that if you care about the author and you have that kind of a bond with them, and you know this is a book that you might want to give to your children one day, or you want to keep on your shelf for years, or you just happen to like TR, you pay $40 for it. I don't know.
But it is a big fat book. It's a lot to carry around. You would think that it would cry out to be read digitally because it's so big and heavy, and yet people seem to prefer the hardcover.
I think it's a demographic thing too. I think history is one of the more challenging areas for us. And I think there's a worrying sense, I don't know, and you publish a lot of history, a worrying sense that the audience for serious history is shrinking exponentially. I know, and you represent some historians. I think it's one of the most challenged areas, and I think the people who are still reading it are habituated to physical book reading, and it's the way they take it in. And those people are, I think, probably fewer than the norm now, which is some hybrid of physical and e.
So we're heading into the Christmas buying season, which is a very, very big season for the industry. Books still make excellent gifts, but it's very difficult to gift an ebook, or at least not as satisfying as actually handing it to somebody. Have you seen any difference in the Christmas buying patterns? Have you seen any difference in the January buying patterns after people get their new iPads or their new devices come December, and what do those look like?
I don't have numbers but January, because
January is a good month for you.
they're given gift cards or devices.
Because January used to be death. It used to be like going over a cliff. Because if people were going to buy books for somebody, they would buy books in December and November.
There's a leveling off, though. Our budget, we were very tasked with an expectation that the ebook growth would continue to be exponential, and it just wasn't. I mean, we really all were sort of set, Random House has had a great couple of years, but I think every division was set back on its heels a bit because ebooks just stopped growing the way they were growing. And I think there are lots of theories, but it's possible people are they've got their new way of reading now. They have their devices. They're not filling up, like a kid in a candy store the way they maybe once were.
Right. So in terms of the different way that we approach publishing today than we did ages ago, you acquired Seabiscuit. What year was that?
What year was it?
Do you remember?
I think it was around 1994.
1994. Wow.
2000. I don't remember. I don't know.
Would it be published differently today? Or do you think all the tools that you would bring to bear on Seabiscuit would be exactly the same tools that you brought to bear in 1994?
I don't think it would be published that much differently, actually. There were a lot of advanced readers editions, and people read it and loved it. Again, it was one of those books where everybody knew. I remember the sales rep from Maine stood up at sales conference and said, "We're going to sell 1 million copies of this book." I mean, when does anybody ever say something like that in a public meeting? It's unusual. So I think that we knew what we had, and I think that the books that capture the public's imagination that way, they're just really good. I mean, what Molly said about history being a tough category is right, and it immediately made me think of a book that Doubleday published a couple years ago called Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard. I don't know if anybody's read that book, but it's just so good, and it made me feel the way I felt a little bit when I read Seabiscuit, in the sense that it was very rich narrative storytelling in a historical context, and you felt the character of this president, Garfield, who nobody ever really thinks about anymore, and then you're in the head of the assassin, and these two forces are colliding, and it was just masterful storytelling, and that's history that deserves to be read.
And it was a bestseller.
And it was a bestseller, and it found its audience. So, long-winded answer, yeah, Seabiscuit would be published the same way.
Now, in terms of conventional wisdom, at the time that you acquired Seabiscuit, the conventional wisdom was that nobody read books about thoroughbred horse racing.
Right.
And it was dismissed as a book by many publishers as a book about thoroughbred horse racing. It was not, obviously. It was a book about the Depression. It was a book about comebacks. It was a book about
an underdog, yeah.
It's a book about America. Yeah,
book about America.
And I was liberated by my complete ignorance about horse racing. I didn't know that people didn't read a book about horse racing. I had no knowledge of Seabiscuit until the literary agent Tina Bennett said, "Would you like to read a book about Seabiscuit?" And I said, "No." And she sent it to me anyway.
That's better than saying, "Who's Seabiscuit?" I'm sure was the reaction that some people had. No, it's one of the great publishing stories. So speaking of conventional wisdom, are there still areas that you just wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole? Is there still conventional wisdom that says you can't sell a book about?
Oh, that's different from books we wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole.
There's all these, I think probably every house has its own little thing. Like, I remember for a while at my old job, is green covers don't sell.
Green covers.
Yes. Fiction
See
about...
how scientific it is?
Yeah. Fiction about music doesn't sell. Fiction about art doesn't sell. I mean...
Books about TV.
Books about art heists don't sell.
Books about TV, you said.
Yeah.
And what about books about Hollywood? Books about the
Bill
film
Carter's-
industry?
Those sell.
Books about Hollywood? Yeah, those can sell.
So there are no black holes. You don't get a call from someone saying, "This is a great book about contemporary Russia."
I think you're right about books about TV. And there are some great writers about TV. I think it's for some reason, that's not how people want to experience. Bill Carter wrote the great book.
Yeah, the late shift.
The Late Shift. I feel like that's the only comp available to anybody.
What about fathers writing about their sons?
I was going to say,
That doesn't work.
I was going to say fatherhood. Many years ago, I represented an incribly funny
Beautiful
book
boy,
about
though.
fatherhood.
Beautiful boy.
Well, there are always these
Okay, so if your
exceptions.
son's a drug addict, that'll sell.
Well,
But fatherhood generally, I think, is a tough one because it seems like such an obvious Father's Day promotion, and yet the conventional wisdom holds that guys don't read books about fatherhood.
even Michael Lewis.
Well,
is
the Tender
one of
Bar.
probably the best.
What's that?
The Tender Bar, there's an exception to that.
That's a
Well,
good
that was about sonhood.
Yeah, and also that was
Never
set in a
mind.
bar.
It's about being a
Right.
son, yeah, right.
I don't know.
Michael
Pinna
Lewis
Rosa
even
knew
writing
you were
about
good.
being a father was his least
successful book.
Least successful book.
Whose book?
Michael Lewis.
You don't even know about the book.
No, I do know. I remember it.
So it's not off limits.
It's not what?
So we can sell you a book about fatherhood, no problem.
Do you have something to tell me about later?
I don't.
It would be crazy to have a blanket rule. Yeah, we all have our, as editors, personal.
I have worked for publishers who have blanket rules, and I wanted to rip out every last curl on my head because I always had a
proved
reason.
wrong at some point. Like, you know, you should, but I don't want to, I'm not going to read science fiction.
You're not going to.
Science fiction.
What about covers with empty chairs on them? I hate that.
Wait a minute. Hattie, The Lives of Hattie.
I know. Art directors love to give you covers with empty chairs. It's supposed to symbolize the absence. You know, just get a model. Put somebody in the chair.
Well, but then there are many authors who object to models representing the characters in their book because they say, right, it's too specific, and I want the reader to imagine.
They should get over that.
But then there are also people who object to headless women on the cover.
Yeah, and there are a lot of them. There are a lot of
headless
well,
women.
I have to say, so Eric represents Stacy Schiff, and she wrote this totally masterful biography of Cleopatra, and I remember seeing the.
Oh, that was so brilliant.
Oh, really?
I did not get it. They were
I
so
did
what
not
it was.
get it.
If you see it, it's a photo shoot of a woman, and she's sort of three-quarters turned, and she has her hair in an elaborate thing, and it's
also
a
looking like she's from
photo.
Tudor England.
But it was
contemporary.
It was
brilliant. It made you feel like Cleopatra was actually a woman.
And I thought, Cleopatra, that lady, but it wasn't specific enough. Nobody knows what she actually looked like, of course. So it was exactly that. It made it feel fresh and like this is a woman, a very alive woman, and a very alive book. And how wrong I was. That cover.
It was a very challenging book to jacket, which your art departments contend with all the time. There were no existing images of Cleopatra from when she was alive, except one very homely profile from a coin, which they were not going to put on the cover of the book. So this was their solution, and it obviously worked. What's the hardest jacketing experience you've ever had?
For me, I find it's the books that I really love. You know, like I just had this with a great young editor, and the way the jacket process works, just briefly, is the editor comes in and tells the art department a little bit about the book with a jacket brief and a few lines. The author wants this, editor suggests this, and we talk about it briefly. We put up cover comp slides and go from there. So this editor, he described exactly what he wanted. I mean, it was so specific that I was like, it's like too much, like very detailed. And weirdly, the art department commissioned an illustrator who delivered exactly that in a way that was very unusual and lively, and I just loved it. And I think because he had such a clear image of what he had in mind, and it wasn't quite what he was seeing there, he was like, well, the type, the this, and and I'm constantly browbeating him now. It's been 2 weeks of me working on him and the author. Like, it's a great jacket. But I think, so sometimes it's when you're so invested in the book and you're so close to it, and it's hard to marry your internal image of the book with the one that you're presented with, and it can take some time. And sometimes, I remember once I walked into a jacket meeting and they showed me a bunch, and I said, and the art director said, remind me to play poker with you, because I just loved it instantly, and I couldn't, sometimes you have to make them work a little bit.
We did a book called The Rosie Project, and it was a beloved romantic comedy. It came out in October, and the book has been published internationally in something like 31 countries. So we saw 31 covers, and we didn't think any of them were right. Actually, the U.S. was one of the last territories to publish this book, and we went through 50 possible covers, and it was just a very hard book to get right. Now, the other funny story, which I probably shouldn't tell because it's politically incorrect, but we had an author who was blind, and she wrote a wonderful book, and she kept giving us very specific direction on the cover. And I could just see how pissed off our art director was getting, taking this criticism. But she was showing it to other people, and she was asking them what they thought, and it's amazing.
Everybody's a critic.
That's the worst part, though. Yeah. Blind or not blind, when you get. I showed this to my writing group, and then you get all this collective feedback.
I have to say, I have two covers. I would say that on Gone Girl, we were going nowhere fast. And I really thought I was overthinking it, and I think I had become that person who had some sort of idealized vision for how it should look, and we had 5 meetings in, and it was getting so elaborate and so wrong. And then the art director, as we're ending the meeting, said, well, I have this. and it was the whipping hair, and it was the type. And I just said, why the fuck didn't you show me this 6 weeks ago? I couldn't believe it. Done. And then we had to mix our own vat of certain pink. And this color that we had had to be like mixed between 4 different Pantone colors, and it became this enormous nightmare at the plant because they couldn't get it right, and we had all this salmon color, and suddenly the simplest cover in the world became incredibly complicated. But it was they finally nailed it without any input from me. And the other one was a book called Ready Player One. Has anyone read Ready Player One? Turned out to be a great cover. Again, I was at a company that was transitioning from its old self and morphing into its new self, and we could not get this cover right. It was an incredible coming-of-age novel set in a virtual reality, and part of it has to do with gaming and a lot of 1980s nostalgia. And getting that cover right was of such paramount importance, and I think we did 400 different comps for that cover. And it's an all type, one of the best covers we've ever had. But the book was so important to our changing identity at Crown that we had to get it right, and we did.
I think people would be surprised to hear that almost no market research goes into any of this.
Yeah.
Oh, I have a good story about that.
Oh, go ahead.
I published Tina Fey's book, Bossy Pants, and that has, if you've seen the cover, it's Tina, but she's being embraced by these really hairy man arms. And we did a photo shoot for the cover before we had a title, which was a super great way to do it. And she did all these different costume ideas, very different one from the other. I won't go in. Anyway, but there was one that was her with her hair up, and we thought we might call it Bossy Pants. So they'd written it in like a mustache across her upper lip, and she looked super pretty, and that was really cute and funny. And then there was the one with the man arms, and so we all loved the cute and pretty one, and she loved the man arms, and we were like, oh. And I remember our chairman coming in. We were getting it ready to go to Frankfurt in the book fair with a big poster, and he was like, so and then our sales director at the time said, the Barnes & Noble is going to hate this, and on and on. And so we had Tina in, and she's really great, and we said we'd like to market test this. So she said, I'll stand by. I'll go with whatever your results give you. So we took those 2 and into 11 malls across America, and it was fun to see the kinds of questions like, if you bought this book, what do you think of this? If you bought, what kind of, it's complicated, but there were a lot of different questions that went into finding out what people thought of this. And the hairy arms won, hands down. And so Tina said, it's the first time market testing has ever worked in my favor. So we did do that because we had a lot invested in that book, and because we definitely thought, like, we have such different visions of that book. It was also interesting. She's so smart, and she said, this picture of me is really pretty, and that's not what my fans think of me. It's not the me that they like is being pretty and sort of soft. They like me to be weird.
And how often do you do that? I'm assuming that's a rarity.
We've done it for like Michael Connelly covers. We've done it, when you have a lot invested in you want to make sure that that you're getting the right look and the right audience, and speaking to the audience that you are trying to reach.
My former colleague Mort Janklow represents Danielle Steele and tells a story about standing behind 2 elderly ladies in an airport bookstore in front of an entire wall of Danielle Steele paperbacks, and one says to the other, I just love her work. And the other one says, which one's your favorite? And she says, the aqua one. So there's that. And lastly, titles. What is the worst title experience or the best title experience you've had, John?
Well, the Seabiscuit, I guess, was originally called Four Good Legs, because between the jockey and the horse, they had 4 good legs. We changed it to Seabiscuit, but then we
you changed it to Dark Horse.
Well, no, we changed it to Seabiscuit, and then somebody said, we should really call this book Dark Horse, because it's about Dark Horse. So we changed it to Dark Horse, and then at the sales conference, they begged us to change it back to Seabiscuit, and we did.
I still have an advanced reader's copy that says Dark Horse.
That's worth a lot of money.
Really?
Yeah. You should. No, really, it's worth it.
I'll put it in the vault for later. But it says Dark Horse. It's the exact same cover, except it says Dark Horse on it.
Yeah.
That was a near miss. I remember when Nan Graham sent me a copy of Angela's Ashes, and I thought, that's the worst title I've ever heard. And what a depressing looking photograph. And I was wrong about that, obviously. Molly?
I cannot think of one.
Really?
Yeah. They matter a lot.
They matter a
Titles
lot.
are incredibly
We
important.
have meetings, every list. We go
You know-
through every title and every subtitle. And sometimes it's just to say, yeah, we like this. And a lot of times it's to really work and work and work.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, what was it?
Man Who Hated Women.
That's right.
Yes. The Man Who Hated Women. Then again, Trimalchio at West Egg probably would not do as well as The Great
The
Gatsby either.
yes,
so.
that's really good.
You're optimistic, the three of you, about us all having jobs next year and the year after that, you think?
I am confident.
You're confident, okay. Molly is...
I know I seem dark.
No,
but
you don't
actually,
seem dark. You seem acknowledging the moment of transition that we're experiencing.
I feel we are an industry of brave people, really committed to what we are doing. And as long as we don't put our heads in the sand, as long as we embrace change and try to be part of the complexity rather than sort of confounded by it, I think we will continue to supply extraordinary things for people who love to read.
Right?
Same. We're here to help people tell stories and to help people read stories, and that's sort of what that in whatever medium they choose, that's always the need, and we're here to fulfill it.
Thank you so much for participating. Thank you all for coming.